Welcome to our 9th roundtable session in Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations. Today our session is on anti-racism practices in education. And if you use the subtitles, we have them turned on our side. Please just check in your settings to make sure that they're turned on your side, and then they should work for the live audio subtitles. All right, so we are gathered here today on the Misquitchie-Wisconsin traditional Treaty 6 territory of the First Nations and Métis Nation of Alberta Zone 4. We respectfully acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this land for generations, including the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota, Blackfoot, as well as the Métis and Inuit. This land is and has been a welcoming place for all peoples who come to Edmonton and call it home. It is a place built for community, trade, friendship, and shared understanding. We recognize those Indigenous peoples who are still fighting for equality today, and we support them in the spirit of decolonization and reconciliation. We remain committed to honoring the struggle of our Indigenous siblings and joining with them to end injustice. Together, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and ancestors to help us work together in the spirit of community and understanding today and onwards. So why do we do treaty acknowledgements? We are all treaty people. Long ago, when the first settlers came to this land, they drafted treaties that Indigenous people signed with goodwill and in good faith. Those settlers and settlers up until today have not always honored those treaties. So today we acknowledge the treaty land as a way to recommit to honoring the spirit of those treaties and to recognize the continued rights of Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land. We recognize that many Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed of their land and traditional ways of life, and along with it, the prosperity that came along with it. We acknowledge treaty to understand that we each have a role to play as treaty people in reconciliation and righting the historical wrongs that have taken place. And we would like to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to let us know what treaty area you are in the chat below. So a little about us. Since its establishment in 1993, the Centre for Race and Culture, CFRAC, formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you'd like to learn more about our current events, please visit our website, cfrac.com. So a little about our roundtable series. This session is part of our new initiative titled Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations, and it's an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. We hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. And we have an upcoming session on April 20th on ageism in Alberta. We'd love to see you there, same time. So we're always interested in collaborating. If you feel that you have suggestions, comments, ideas, please email me at assistant@cfrac.com. It's just there on the screen. And now, super quickly, because I know that you guys have so many questions, we're really glad that you're all here. We'll just launch some anonymous polls on the screen. You don't have to answer, but it does help us to understand our audience better. So we appreciate it if you do. So we'll just take about a minute to answer these, and then I will introduce our speakers this evening. All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you for answering. We'll just wait a little bit longer and then we'll go on. Awesome. Thank you guys for participating in the chat and letting us know a little bit about where you are and the treaty land you're on. We really appreciate that. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Next, I would like to introduce you to our speakers for this evening. There we go. Thank you. I'd like to introduce you to our speakers this evening, starting with Gail-Ann Wilson. Gail-Ann Wilson is a writer on the topic of anti-Black racism in education. She's a presenter and cultural diversity education consultant for Edmonton Public School Division. Her work focuses on promoting good relationships and practices in education to combat racism. This stems from her own experience as a Caribbean newcomer over 40 years ago. After working for 20 years as a senior high school social studies teacher, Gail-Ann knows the impact of racial marginalization in education due to the distinct underrepresentation of Black female teachers in Alberta. She has published articles in the ATA newsletter and was a co-guest editor and contributor of content for the fall 2021 Alberta Teachers Association magazine, focused on anti-Black racism in Alberta schools. Her anti-racism writing has also been published in the news magazine of the Manitoba Teachers Society and Melanistic magazine. Gail-Ann also has a master's in communication from the University of Alberta. Next, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Elizabeth Shen. Dr. Shen is an EPSB Specialized Learning Support Supervisor with the portfolios of Comprehensive School Health, Diversity Education, and International Programs. She completed her master's in education using critical race theory to examine multicultural practices and policies and to advocate for the need to incorporate anti-racism and anti-oppression education into schools. Using a critical realist ontology, she completed her PhD in ethnic identity studies, focusing on strategy-based methods to build students' positive ethnocultural identity as a way to address racism and inequity in schools. As a principal for 13 years and another 15 years in classrooms, she uses her education and lived experience as a Chinese Canadian to turn theory into practice and provide differentiated, pragmatic ways to bring integrative anti-racism to fruition. Lastly, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this evening, one of our own board members. This is Youssra Badr. Youssra is an Arab Canadian diversity consultant. She completed her studies at the University of Alberta, earning a Bachelor of Arts, double majoring in psychology and sociology, a Bachelor of Education, and a Master's in Educational Policy, specializing in theoretical, cultural, and international studies. She has spent many years in classrooms as an educator and an ESL consultant, supporting English language learners and their teachers. Youssra advocates for anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in both her personal and professional life. Youssra volunteers for several organizations supporting governance and advisory committees, including the Alberta Teachers Association, the Africa Center, Islamic Family and Social Services, and the Center for Race and Culture. So this is our panel for this evening. Thank you so much for your attention. Please use the Q&A button to ask your questions. I'm now going to hand the event over to Youssra, and she's going to provide us with a short introduction on why this topic is so important in Alberta at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serafina, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight and share space with these wonderful women. I'd like to start us off with a quote from Raewyn Connell. She said, "An education that privileges one child over another is giving the privileged child a corrupted education, even as it gives him or her a social or economic advantage." In order to address anti-racism in education, we need to support students' understanding of the impacts of racism, while at the same time shifting towards creating equity and societal changes. A large part of this includes acknowledging that our education system is often an unpleasant space for people of color. It's important that anti-racist education discuss issues of equity, power, and access, and how systemic inequalities are contributing to that environment for students who are not white. Racism is present in individual acts of prejudice and discrimination, and violent incidents against people of color in the media and stereotypes that are promulgated everywhere we look. However, it's important to understand that racism goes far beyond this. I really like how Dr. Beverly Tatum refers to it. She calls it the smog of racism. It is everywhere you look, whether you see it clearly or not. Looking at Alberta's current climate and the hate that has unfortunately been demonstrated here, I believe much of this hate grows from a fear of the other. If we can actively counter that othering through education, what impact will that have on our understanding and acceptance? In an education system, the smog of racism can be found in the over-disciplining of non-white students, in the fact that students of color and immigrant or refugee students are overrepresented in special needs classes and lower academic streams. This starts as early as kindergarten. Looking at representation in schools, do students see themselves represented in the power structures? Looking at who is the principal, who are the teachers, how do they identify? Going into the curriculum and the literature, where do students see themselves and their communities represented? Do students see themselves represented in a curriculum that focuses only on European expansion and contributions, silencing and misrepresenting the voices of everyone else? Students from historically excluded communities need to see themselves and their histories represented in the curriculum as well. In terms of cultural celebrations and acknowledgement of those important celebrations, are students able to see themselves represented in a system where they need to seek accommodation to attend events that are so integral to their identity? When looking at representation in educational spaces, I encourage you to look for what is absent, not at what is present. How can we help all students see the impacts of racism, to understand how the systems of power and privilege have worked and continue to work, privileging some at the expense of others? In seeing this, what we do with that knowledge is important. Anti-racism is an active process, one that requires active participation. Anti-racist educators can take this information and use it to engage students in understanding issues of power, identity, and privilege, and challenge the systems of inequity that prevail in society, and by extension in our schools and school systems. Educators who are committed to anti-racism know that if we want to create a large systemic change that's going to positively impact Alberta's society, we must first start by creating an understanding and a commitment to anti-racism in Alberta's classrooms. So with this, I'll lead into our first question. Looking at the curriculum in Alberta, how can curriculums reproduce racism? Why has there been such widespread criticism of Alberta's new curriculum? Dr. Shen, can you start us off with that question?
Thank you so much, Youssra. So I have the fortune of working with several First Nations, Métis, and Inuit consultants with our division. And they are a most excellent reminder of how our curriculum continues to reproduce racism. And I think one of the ways in which it's most obvious is in a statement that they constantly remind me of, which is, yes, it is truth and reconciliation, but it does actually need to be truth before reconciliation. That if you don't understand the truth of someone's lived circumstance, then to try and create that atmosphere of true reconciliation, it's not necessarily going to be successful because you don't know the lived experience of other people. And so our curriculum at this point in time does not allow us to truly take a look at what truth has been. There are many efforts being made by individual teachers and certain aspects of the curriculum that do allow us to say, okay, we are learning about and are gaining foundational knowledge about our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students and their families. But at what point in time is there more in-depth look at other histories as well? No question though, first and foremost, we need to be looking at our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and there have been efforts made on that, but we still hear so frequently simple statements like, why in Edmonton, which is where I am located, have we changed the names within our city to be the original names that were held when the First Nations people were there? Why can't we just go back to being whatever wards we were before without these names? Well, that is a complete lack of understanding of what reconciliation means. It's not about new and difficult words to pronounce. It's about understanding that this land belonged to other people before us. If we can't even have conversation about our own wards within our city, or the fact that Edmonton, when we talk about a treaty recognition and we refer to it as being Edmonton as opposed to Amiskwichi-Waskahigan, we have an issue where we haven't even gotten to the truth yet. And so our curriculum is not allowing for the greater understanding of what the history was of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, the immigrants, and their contributions to what is an amazing, part of the whole of Edmonton, the whole of Alberta, the whole of Canada, not just based on, of course, the European colonization of Turtle Island. So we're missing what one might call the truth in the curriculum. And if we're missing the truth, then obviously we can't have full reconciliation. And that is just in terms of First Nations, Métis, Inuit people. When we go to the immigrants, besides the European colonizers, we don't recognize on a consistent basis anyways, what it is that other cultures, other races, other diversities have created or contributed to Canada. We fall back on the typical food, dress, dance, and we don't get into all of the amazing people that contributed to the creation of what Alberta is today. And so, our curriculum at present and potentially future is not allowing teachers to delve deeply into truth. And without that, obviously, we just continue to produce the racism that exists.
Thank you, Dr. Shen, for bringing up the importance of truth in history and the truth of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit ancestors. Gail-Ann, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Dr. Shen, thank you. That was a very, very comprehensive and very robust answer. I think that just taking a look at all of the questions that we have today, some of our responses will overlap because themes are, they just thread through so many of the discussion that we have when we're looking at racism and we're looking at especially curriculum. I think, echoing some sentiments, one being that our curriculum, especially our current curriculum, is centered on traditional ways of thinking and doing. And that also will lend itself to what we see with, what we have seen with the upcoming curriculum. So the drafts that have been shared with us for K-6. So some of the things that we have to consider is that the lens in which we are viewing curriculum has generally had a euphemistic approach to the way things have been presented. So to just reemphasize, my educational or my work history, I should say, in education has been very strongly rooted in high school social studies. So I've done that for about 20 years. And so a lot of the perspective that I come with comes from teaching the content that we had in social 10, 20, and 30. And so an example that I'm going to use to just really, to bring home the point that we use this euphemistic approach is taking a look at topic 2 in social 10. And that topic is called Legacies of Historical Globalization. The language that we're using to talk about atrocities is instead replaced with the word legacy. So what we're doing is softening all of the atrocities and all of the harm that we are now addressing in society today. So when we look at how we have taught residential schools, we've taken a very soft approach to teaching that. And we've done that in a way because we've done it in such a way that we have centered the feelings of colonizers over the actual historical impacts that we can see. Now, if we look at science, for example, this is not my area, but just a historical lens, taking a look at Newton. Newton is an example that is actually brought up in science. And when we take a look at the history of this individual, what we can see is Newton, in fact, invested in a company whose business model included the legal monopoly to supply African slaves to the Spanish Empire. And so when we're examining why we would use somebody like that, and we are actually, talking about the positive contributions that they've made to humanity, we really have to actually look at the lens in which we are advancing some of these folks that we think have made these really amazing contributions. I would go on to further say, looking at the new curriculum, one of the biggest things that's absent is the idea that it does not consider the TRC's calls to action, specifically education for reconciliation, which is number 62. And I'm just going to actually read what that says. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal people, and educators to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, Aboriginal peoples, historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory education requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. So this is really telling us that even when we have had this awakening as Canadians, we are talking about reconciliation. The absence of this in that draft curriculum speaks very loud and clear to some of the issues that we have where we are not being very honest, I would have to say, about the fact that racism in fact exists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gail-Ann, for that comprehensive response and for focusing on what's absent in our current system. With the next question, how do we know about experiences of racism in schools? Is there any official statistics in Canada and or Alberta? Dr. Shen, can you start us off?
I'm not aware of any official statistics in Canada, potentially no, that's not true. Let me take a step back. I don't have any on me. However, I've attended many sessions in regards to Canada and Alberta where there are statistics that speak to the over-representation of people of color and Indigenous people within disciplinary actions, behavior, the expectations around behavior. There would also be some in terms of students and their academic achievement. Now there's caution in that because of course all things are intersectional, and so there would be intersection between you know, a person of color and their indigenous or their Indigenous identity. Excuse me, as well as their levels of poverty, their parents' past levels of education, and so forth. That stated, it is all based in racism. People who are in a state of poverty, that has racism embedded within it as well. Those people who do not have higher levels of education, there is racism based in that as well. So when we talk about experiences of racism in school, the statistics often focus around more of the intersectional pieces, but all of those intersectional pieces are grounded in racism. How do we know about experiences of racism in school? Well, I can certainly say very proudly that at least within Edmonton Public Schools, we've had many conversation circles, and we've had many opportunities to speak with students and staff around that racism, and our division is very forthright in saying that absolutely racism exists, and it exists within Edmonton Public Schools. And those experiences tell us that children, students feel like they are marginalized in some way, shape, or form, whether that is by other students or by staff members, and whether that is purposeful or unconscious in terms of their own unconscious biases that may be exerting themselves. So we do know that racism exists within schools, and how is it affecting our children in every way, shape, and form. Certainly within their academics, certainly within how they are treated in terms of their behavior. But beyond that, it is also absolutely affecting their mental health and how they are able to cope and deal with different situations, and with their ability to be resilient. Within some of my own research, there was intersection, of course, with incidences of racism and their ability to be resilient against that racism, or be able to be resilient against the mental health that resulted from those issues of racism. And it was those kids that were taught very specifically about how to deal with racism, and that racism would exist in their lives, and that there were ways in which we could address them, that were able to say, okay, I now know how to deal with racism and can overcome the mental health harms that may be caused by this. But because there's still a hesitancy to speak openly about anti-racism, about racism that exists in schools, and about how we can deal with it without becoming defensive or without becoming concerned about the repercussions of discussing it. We don't have those open conversations, and therefore those experiences of racism, as well as the results of those experiences, continues to be very prevalent within our school systems at this time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shen, for highlighting the importance of intersectionality in anti-racism work, and the importance also of teaching children how to address racist incidents when they occur. Gail-Ann, can you please share with us your experience of racism in schools and any statistics or data you might have or be aware of in Canada and Alberta?
Yeah, absolutely. It's likely the best kept secret is, I think, one of the answers that we have to look at here. How do we know about these experiences? Well, we know that they happen, but we're also very good at denying that they happen. We're also very good at explaining away or reasoning away that they happen or why they happen. I think that the stories are abundant. I'm a person who prescribes to this idea. I share those experiences with a certain degree of caution. I have some very extraordinary stories of racism. And that has happened actually as a student. That involves horrific name calling. I've been a person that's lived in Edmonton since the age of 2 years old. So all of my education has been in Edmonton. And then I moved into teaching here in the same place, working for the same school division. So, it isn't new. It isn't something that we're actually seeing a significant transformation in up until right around now. But the point I'm making is I've been very cautious about sharing some of those stories because I call them campfire stories. And the reason I do that is because some of them are very, very extraordinary in terms of what had taken place. And when I share those with people, sometimes they look at that as rationalization to not say that they are racist because something that extreme didn't happen to them. So we know that there are many microaggressions. We know that there are many ways in which students, teachers, parents, community members are marginalized. We understand language plays a huge part of this. We've seen just even in our presentation today, examples in which it occurs even in curriculum. So when we're talking about these experiences, I was very proud to be able to support the work that was done by a number of Black educators in the feature that we had worked on in the fall 2021 edition for the ATA magazine. And it answered specifically the question, what does it feel like to be a Black teacher in Alberta? And it wasn't an easy question to answer. So my colleagues and I, even in our own discussions, we rationalized a lot of our experiences because quite honestly, you don't feel like you'll be believed or you have to convince others. And to be able to do that in an editorial way created quite a few personal issues for us. We know that these experiences are happening, but it's who speaks about them and how that can actually be shared with folks so that you don't have to continually convince people. A couple of other things to consider, language. I mentioned that before. What we tend to do and how we tend to see these experiences of racism is because language appropriation takes place and it gives the dominant group control over the language. So they get to decide whether something is racist or not. In presentations that I do, I talk quite a bit about the use of the N-word or the 6 letters that I call it. And perhaps a little later, I can share some of my own thinking around that. But language is a very, very big piece of that. So in terms of the statistics, there are a couple of things that I can share with you. And Dr. Shen made an excellent point. We do not gather that statistical data with a lot of frequency and definitely not a lot of accuracy. I was looking at some statistics. Again, the question here is the application of it to Canadian schools. But when we're looking at discipline, For example, what we have seen, and more so in North American schools, is rates of suspension, where we would actually see Black males that are suspended 3 times more often than white males. And what's extraordinary is when we look at that number in terms of females, we would see that Black females are suspended 6 times more frequently than their counterparts that are white. So those are some statistics to consider, because the discussion isn't always about the teaching and learning. What about the discipline aspects? A statistic that I can share with you as well is about the teacher diversity gap, and that is the idea that we really are at a disadvantage in terms of representation. So the only statistics that I've ever been able to locate on this come from Ontario. And in that province, it says that racial minorities represent 26% of the overall population, yet they make up only 10% of the 70,000 secondary teachers and only 9% of the nearly 120,000 elementary teachers. So those are some ideas that are, some numbers that are really reinforcing the idea that we're at a huge deficit in terms of, again, going back to the perspective and lens in which racialized communities are able to offer some non-colonial understanding, so decentered white understandings of the way that they actually fit into the world and fit into our curriculums. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gail-Ann, for sharing your experience and that comprehensive information on the statistics that you found. Moving into our next question, what barriers exist for racialized individuals in the education system? Gail-Ann, will you start us off on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of these, I think that this is actually pretty similar to our last question. So some of the barriers really come back to not having proper representation. So when we're looking at how that impacts our students, it also impacts our teachers. So we understand that when students can't see me, they can't be me. And it's going to create a little bit of a crisis for students to be able to see themselves in their curriculum, but also see how the learning actually applies to them. So when we're addressing how these actually become barriers, what we're also asking students to do is ingest prejudiced beliefs, biased beliefs that really are, again, centered on colonial or white understandings that can create a huge amount of conflict for students. So I think that one of the biggest barriers is when we're trying to reconcile how students take in what we are teaching to be truth versus, being able to offer them critical thinking. If we have teachers that come in with their own biases or come in with their own worldviews, it tends to actually reinforce their perspective on things. And so what ends up happening in this, I can actually speak to as a student of education in Alberta. It's the belief that I was inadequate, the belief that I was not equal to my white counterparts because I wasn't represented in curriculum and it wasn't seen as valued in curriculum. So all of those things ultimately shape the adult that I become. When I moved into education as a teacher, I actually viewed many of the folks that I worked with, especially those in leadership, as being far more capable. Not only did I not see other Black leaders, but I also believe that those spaces were actually designed for people that I was told were of greater value in society because that's all I had ever seen as a student. So I think that those barriers are, they're very vast. I'm only talking about a drop in the bucket for the many ways in which this question could be answered. But just taking a look at how all of this shapes the identity and the value that students have that go on to become folks that are contributing to the workforce, I think that it's quite profound. Thanks, Youssra.
Thanks so much, Gail-Ann. Elizabeth, Dr. Shen, do you have anything to add to that?
Elizabeth is just fine. Yes, I mean, I can't, and Gail-Ann has done an excellent job of speaking to it. I cannot emphasize the importance of representation being the biggest barrier. And I know sometimes when we speak about representation, we speak about, of course, the people that are in front of the students. And absolutely, I agree 150,000% that the people in front of the students need to be representative of who the students are. And going beyond that, it is about the curriculum, which we talked about. Where's the representation in the curriculum? Where is the recommendations for the different, potential pieces of literature that can be used in English or in social studies or in science that, speak to the different ethno-cultural and religious diversities that exist all over the world. We don't talk about the Confucius, scientists that existed and created so many of what is common in the world today. We don't talk about universities stemming from the Islamic world. We don't talk about many of the incredibly important contributions that did not come from European society, and that is representation. Youssra, you spoke earlier about what is missing. What is missing? That is erasure. You are erasing the history of people. And by erasing the history of people, you have accomplished also erasing the belief that the people have in themselves and their own ability to achieve something or to go beyond the expectations that society has set out for them. Those barriers, they are huge barriers, because then children will see what they see in the media or what they see close to their lives. And if their life is one that is in poverty, they're not going to elevate themselves beyond that. And again, those pieces are all intersectional. So that poverty is based perhaps in, of course, parents' levels of education, in the spaces that they're living, and they don't see beyond those barriers in order to go and move beyond them themselves. So by not having representation, by having a consistent space of erasure, our educational system is really harming, of course, our racialized individuals.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shen, for that and for bringing up the importance of representation. And I think it's important to note as well that representation in our current curriculum is possible and is available. Looking anywhere, any curriculum that's talking about art, history, math, sciences is going to have multiple representation from diverse populations. It's just sometimes harder to find. And that's something I think is really important. We need to make it easier for teachers to find. It needs to be embedded into our textbook because it's there. History of geometry, the history of educational institutions, all of these things are already there. History of algebra, the importance of the zero, the scientific hypothesis, all of those stem from diverse populations and are available already in our current curriculum. We don't need to change the curriculum to include voices of diversity and representation. Thank you so much for that. Looking at our next question, how can we support racialized students, teachers, and parents who face discrimination in schools? Gail-Ann, will you start us off?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the most important questions that we have to ask, not just in this space, but overall. This is really speaking to the shift in thinking that we have to all belong to if we're really committed to moving towards anti-racism. I think that this is just the advice that I share with people on the most basic level, and it's believe someone when they tell you that they are experiencing racism. It's critical. So regardless of whether we've got a student, teacher, parent, believe them. It is really important that we don't begin to question and we don't ask for rationalization. We don't We don't begin to ask folks to provide evidence that this is happening. In order to support people, let's believe exactly what their lived experience is. And so I commonly say to people, don't ask what happened, but instead ask, how were you treated? It's a completely different space to start a conversation. And it allows folks to recognize that their experience is authentic, and it will shift the way that we actually view what has taken place. So another way that I approach this question is to consider the cultural background and consider ensuring that you have greater understanding of the person that you are encountering this racist experience with. Take a look at how this person's own life experiences might be contributing to what's going on. Take a look at your own spaces of power, spaces of privilege that might not allow you to see that this experience is actually very, very real and possibly quite traumatic. And this all involves decentering. So even for myself as a Black woman working in education, I did a really terrible job of this for a number of years as a teacher. I didn't decenter from the role that I believed I was supposed to have as an educator, because that role was really, really rooted on the idea that the way I saw white teachers do it is the way I was supposed to do it. So it becomes very important to continually, regardless of what your own ethnic background is, to check in and make sure that you're actually decentering from some of those spaces of power and privilege. And the last thing I want to share is just consider your own practices when there's moments of contention or acrimony, if especially when we're in schools, when we're taking a look at students that might have many experiences based on being disciplined. And let's even say before they even make it out of elementary, some of those students might start to actually internalize the idea that they're bad or they're just not good enough. We need to start to shift the way that we're thinking about interacting with our students when we have some of these situations, when especially we weren't present for a particular incident that has taken place. Are we emphasizing that there is a villain and a victim, and who are those people, and what kind of biases are we bringing into some of those spaces? So this would actually be, even fair to say with our teachers. This is fair to say even with our parents that are coming into schools and wanting to share what their concerns are. Do we bring biases in, or do we hold biases when these parents come in that make it really, really challenging for us to fully understand what they're going through? And we have to further from that, recognize that some of these folks that might be, sharing that this was traumatic, this was triggering for them, this might not have been the only racist incident that they dealt with in a single day or in that class or in that semester. This is ongoing. And so all of these things really are talking about how we need to decenter our own understanding and prioritize the perspective of the person that's sharing that they are going through a racialized incident. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gail-Ann. I want to highlight some of the things that you mentioned, the importance of cultural understanding, as well as the impact of power and privilege on the situation, and how important it is to listen and create a welcoming space for parents and students. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Shen, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you, Gail-Ann and Youssra. Yeah, I would have to say that we know that there is discrimination of all sorts, not just racial discrimination, ableism, mental capacity, ageism. I mean, there's multitudes of discrimination. And what we really need to do is a couple of things. One, always act in humility. If we ever approach a situation, whether we are the ones that are experiencing it or the ones that are perhaps enacting it, if we do not act in humility, we will never be able to reach a consensus, and really that's what we need. If we act in anger, if we act in hate, if we act in confidence that we've done something correctly, that's never going to result in resolution. We need to support our racialized students, teachers, and parents, but also any other form of ism, simply by listening to them, and whether or not you believe them, I would hope you would, but whether or not you believe them, and I come from the perspective of a principal there, where I'm like, okay, I have to hear one side of the story, and then I have to hear the other side of the story. So you're suspending, I guess, a judgment. You're suspending a belief until you have all the necessary information. And when we are busy acting in humility and busy listening, we also have to dismiss our own biases. As Gail-Ann mentioned, those biases are the key to what creates the discrimination. And if we can overcome our own biases by becoming aware of what they are, when I say overcoming biases, I don't mean get rid of them. We will always have biases, and that is just how it is. Biases are so innately ingrained with us that those biases will take a lot of work to actually dismiss, because they are gut instinct, they are reactionary. And to change something from being a gut instinct or reactionary takes an enormous amount of work over and over and over and over and over again. But if we can suspend those biases and go, oh, wait a minute, that was a bias. Now I need to change my reaction, or now I need to consider whether that bias is impacting the decision I'm making. Then we have the ability to potentially actually truly support a racialized student, teacher, or parent. And absolutely, going back to what Gail-Ann said, you don't live the other person's experience. I've often got, quite frankly, a little bit annoyed when I have anti-racist educators, telling me, Elizabeth, you're not being hard enough, or you got to do more, or, Elizabeth, why did you say it this way? Or everyone, not just everyone learns and teaches and acts from their own lived experience. And you cannot judge what I do based on my own lived experience, or you imparting your own lived experience on me. So, it doesn't matter what your initial reaction is, or what your final conclusion is. What matters is that you validated what the student, the teacher, or the parent has experienced, because through that validation, which again, going back to humility and listening, what that validation does is provides enough space for compromise and for healing to actually start and move forward.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shen. Yeah, I believe the validation in support of diverse communities and by listening and suspending judgment is so important, and being aware of our own biases and how they impact our actions and the impact of our lived experiences on how we're going to react to a situation and how we're going to handle it. Thank you so much. What tools and resources are available to help support students, parents, and educators? Dr. Shen, will you start us off on this one?
Thank you, Youssra. Tools and resources. I truly believe that, of course, the more knowledgeable you are, the better equipped you are to deal with incidences. And so there's no question that there are some excellent books out there that can support students, parents, and educators. Anyone that's attended RPD, and even within this session here, we've talked about bias. Understanding bias is really the key to everybody being able to move past the space that they're in into a space where you are better able to address issues of discrimination. So certainly the book Bias by Jennifer Eberhard is one of the strongest books that I always recommend as a starting place, because once you have a really strong idea of what bias is and how bias works, you are then able to move past that and be able to become more action oriented externally from yourself, in which case, you know, you're better equipped to be able to pursue anti-racism and engage in anti-racism with your students and with your colleagues. The other resources that are there are absolutely the other people that have had those lived experiences with you, because they can empathize with you and they can perhaps help you understand how to navigate a system that can be difficult to navigate. And I noticed in the chat somewhere someone had spoken about daycares. There isn't a system, unfortunately, there isn't a system that exists that doesn't have some form of racism within it. And that is just the structural racism with which the society was created. We know that our society was created all based on Eurocentric values. That is just how it is. If we really wanted all to become 100% anti-racist in our lives, we would all have to just plain old go off grid, because the whole system, you know, the government system, the school system, everything about how we live and breathe right now is based in a structure that was based on Western European norms. And that's not to say that Western European norms are all bad. That's not the case at all. This is what is. This is how we live. This is it. It is the inclusion of those other systems and the ability to make them believable as being of equal value or worth overriding the system sometimes. That's what we are lacking. And so, you know, reading resources reading books that you know, bring in those other centricism, you know, the Afrocentric, Asian centric, other ways of living and being, and even when we speak about that in terms of religious spaces, we know that Christian spaces are centric in our lives, but when we look at and we start learning about other religions, all of a sudden our minds become a little bit more open to how other ways may work, may be encompassed into our day-to-day lives. And so absolutely, you know, there are some excellent books out there. Your own research will help to support students, parents, and educators. And honestly, it is being open to doing things in a different way, turning to other people in a form of true allyship, in a form of co-conspiratorship, where you can actually turn it over to people of other ethnocultural backgrounds to run with, you know, with events that are centric to them. You know, a fine example would be the history months and the heritage months that we have. It's fabulous that we all want to celebrate Black History Month or Asian Heritage Month, but how would that Black History Month or Asian Heritage Month be different if Black people were running those events in your school, or Asian people were running those events in your school, versus you know, the people that are perhaps being the representation in your school, the teachers that aren't the representation in your school. And so, you know, I don't think we have to look for far and wide for tools and resources. I think we have to look within ourselves, and the learning that we can do, and turning to the people that represent the different ethnocultural diversities to help us to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shen. Those were some really valuable resources and tools that you've shared. We have a few questions in the chat. We have about 6 minutes left. So I'm going to move into the questions. Gail-Ann, if you would answer our first question, how might we envision an anti-racist approach to experiential learning experiences?
I'm just going to get you to repeat that. Youssra, is the question, it is in the Q&A, is that correct?
It's in the chat. How might we envision an anti-racist approach to experiential learning experiences?
Can I just ask the person that asked what exactly they mean by experiential learning?
So maybe you could type that in again and we'll move on to one of the other questions.
Sure.
And then we can come back to that. What kind of suggestions do you offer when the racism comes from a student you are teaching in the classroom? How do you educate a student without it feeling like you're attacking them?
Wow, that's such a powerful question. It is, Elizabeth has actually already touched on this. It's with humility. It's a humble space for both the student that we're wishing to educate as well as the educator. Are we actually certain in terms of what we're saying? Like, do we know that the direction that we need to move that child into, that we actually are doing this without our own prejudice or bias? I think that the most powerful tool that I have actually used is questioning. Pretty simple question. What do you mean by that? And allowing a student to actually create some expression around what they're talking about. We can't make the assumption that a child is just coming in with an intention in which they're looking to harm or to be disruptive. So it's very important to actually, pose additional questions, try to seek more information. And in doing that, it gives us an opportunity, even for our own self-reflection. It allows us to actually create what I call space. And that space could actually be in the form of time, could actually be in the form of saying, I need to revisit this. I need to actually step away from it and know that the next steps that I'm going to take with the student are going to be meaningful, but they are going to lead to the right results or the positive impact that I need. So I think that it's really important to ask more questions and get more information, even when we think that we have seen and heard everything that we needed to in that particular situation. I think it's very, very powerful for us to ask those questions and then use a little bit of pause or wait time, even if it is extending past the immediate interaction and saying, I need to step away from this.
Thanks so much, Gail-Ann. For the sake of time, last time I was a moderator, we went over. We have to keep this within the time today. Elizabeth, I'm going to give you two questions because they're both so good. I cannot pick. The first one is, how do you support children or youth who are coming from homes where there's covert racism? Or what is a good starting place for schools with nothing in place? I think those are both two really good questions, and I leave it to you to decide which one to answer. And let me know if I should repeat it.
Let's try and kind of aim for both here. A good place for schools that start with nothing, I would say, is also a place where the child or the youth is coming from where there is covert racism, because I don't know whether the covert racism is intended or just sort of a byproduct of biases, so to speak, is that unconscious bias. I think in both places, though, it comes from having a candid conversation about biases and really normalizing the idea that biases exist. If we can just normalize that bias exists, then nobody gets defensive when somebody says, oh, I think you showed a bias there, right? It's like, oh, I showed a bias. I've seen a few strategies that are used in different spaces. Some people call it a white flag. It's a white flag. I'm raising my white flag to you by telling you that this is a bias. White meaning peace, right? The white flag meaning peacefulness. So it's not done in a space of negativity. It's done in a space of learning. So, you know, in a school that hasn't started anything, if we just start talking about our biases, and you can make them silly biases. You know, we've talked about the Coke versus Pepsi bias. In my personal case, it's the broccoli versus cauliflower bias. You know, we talk about those biases and we just get people to open up, and then we can start talking about more and more of the more difficult biases to attack, so to speak. Books, of course, books are an amazing way to be talking about biases. If you were to read a book about a particular cultural event, and people say, well, that doesn't sound fun, or that's kind of dumb, or whatever. Here we have a bias again, and we can talk about it openly and you know, without judgment, without harm. And once we get to that point of one, being able to identify our biases, and two, being able to have positive conversation that comes from it, then we can start expanding that into more and more difficult biases that might be difficult to talk about. In terms of covert racism coming from home, again, those are based in biases. I must admit that because I have, you know, do come from a space where there are some pretty verbalized biases. You know, I do tend to take a bit of a, you know, a fairly obvious approach, but messaging in terms of putting signs up or statements that really address whatever negativity there may be. One of my favorite posters was, you know, oh, you're sick of hearing about, you know, racism in our society. Well, think about it, you know, how people feel who've been experiencing racism for the last 300 years. You know, little statements in those covert spaces really help to bring truth right to your face. And that almost brings us right back to that, you know, the first conversation about where is the truth in the curriculum. And if it's not within the curriculum, where's the truth within your own teaching, within your own classroom?
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Shen. I found those two questions really important, and thank you for amalgamating both of those into your response with such thoughtful consideration and such practical strategies moving forward. It is now 6:02, and I just want to thank everybody who attended today. I definitely want to thank Dr. Shen and Gail-Ann for being the speakers and answering these questions and the thought that you've given to this. Serafina and Mansouri, thank you so much for hosting us, and to everybody who attended today, thank you so much. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There were some really relevant questions, but we need more time. Next time we need more time. Have a good evening, everyone.